Hey, welcome to another episode of They Never Taught Me That. We are really excited about today's episode. We are going to be covering something that is kind of near to our hearts here on the channel, something that we've written books about, something that we've covered in previous episodes another way, but I don't think we've ever really looked at it from this perspective. So we're really excited to do that. And today we are going to be talking about the history of education. And when you think about They Never Taught Me That, you might immediately think, yeah, they never did teach me about the history of education. As you look at the way in which education has been modeled and conducted and all of the various different changes that has occurred to it, you never really see that come up in school curriculum anywhere. Your teachers never talk to you about why you're in the building that you're in, or why you're learning the way that you do, or how they teach you the things that they do. And that's really important, I think, as a learner, is to understand how this thing has evolved over time. So with that, let's bring in our co-host, Mr. Mike Margison. Mike, how are you doing today?
I'm doing really well. And you're right. It's just taken as a given that the school system is there just the same way that the air is there that we breathe. We don't have to give it another thought, and nobody does. It's just an embedded part of our culture. And it's been with us for so long that most people can't even imagine or envision a life without a school system. And yeah, we're never taught about, like, where did it come from, or where was there a time when there wasn't a school system, and what did that look like, and were people just dumb and walking around? Or yeah, that's never talked about. And that's really what we want to do here on this episode, is talk about maybe different methods of education in history, not theoretical or conceptual, but different methods of education in history, and then kind of the transition to where we are today. And I think that that's important for both students and parents in order to know, because, we hear this all the time, Justin. People look at, like, the test scores for the United States, and, oh, when we're falling behind this and that. And then everybody looks at this and they all sit around and scratch their heads and say, well, how could this be? Well, it's because you don't know the background of the system. And that's really what we would like to do here today. So having said that, since most people don't know what life was like without a school system, what was life like in America without it? Well, first of all, okay, was there life without a school system? And was it just everybody standing around dumbly staring at each other? Or,
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's something that I think is really missed when we look at, and I'll mention this here in just a little bit, as we look at the kind of gradual evolution of the way in which schooling becomes much more formalized in the United States. And so in order to kind of understand, how we got to that point, we got to backtrack a little bit and look at what the attempt to educate people was like prior to the formal school system that we're also aware of and familiar with. And so when we look back, even going back to colonial days, and that's going to be kind of where I pick up. I mean, you can go back even further than that, to the founding before, like, pre-colonial times. But, when you look at, once we are kind of our own independent nation, and we have our government that is kind of running things now. And it was really kind of one of those things where you look and you go, okay, what were their viewpoints about education, and how did that shape and model and mold things for the citizens of this country, especially in a period of time as we started to see westward expansion into new territories. When you look, for example, at the Jeffersonian era, which is where I'm going to really kind of focus in on early and start with, there's a lot of expansion westward. And so what I kind of wanted to start with first and foremost is to kind of think a little bit about the way in which education was viewed. How did it fit into the mold of society during this period of time? And probably the simplest way to do this in a shorter podcast episode is to say that education was primarily left to the individual families of this nation. And obviously, as you look at and study the history of the United States and people moving westward, groups of families were bonding together to form villages and townships, and eventually on into cities and states, and so on and so forth. But it was still the autonomy of the individual families that had the ability to decide what was taught, how it was taught, when it was taught. And again, yes, you're right. Kind of the myth or the misconception is that, everybody was walking around with their knuckles dragging. They were grunting at each other. Nobody knew how to do anything of any substantive value because the government hadn't told them how to do it yet. Of course, that's a false narrative. There was a lot of innovation. There was a lot of great things that were happening. People were doing fantastic work. They were very literate, by the way, which is again another myth that a lot of people think about in colonial America and early Americans, is that everybody was dumb. They couldn't read, they couldn't write, they couldn't do math. In fact, there was a high level of literacy in the States during this period of time. Most people were able to write. Now, again, you have to remember when I say for the time, it's not like what we see today, where we are very much more ingrained and integrated with each other in terms of communication, enough to be able to get by and survive, which was really the kind of the primary focus during this period of time, was being able to, produce enough ideas and things of that nature to be able to survive. And so reading, writing, math were the main focus. It was left up to the individual family. In addition to that, I also wanted to mention, too, that we have to address the role of children during this period of time, which is a fascinating thing to study from a psychological perspective, from a humanities perspective, is how the role of how we view childhood has changed over time. So, the way that we think about children today in childhood is, we see the role of schools as primarily serving the development intellectually, maturity, emotionally, as being left to the individual schools. And I know that's something that we'll talk about more in later in the show. But suffice to say, at this time, childhood really isn't what it looks like today. In other words, what I mean by that as an example is if you think about a child today, say, at the age of like 10 to 12 years old, right? That's kind of one of those ages where we still see them as needing a lot of guiding, a lot of rearing, again, a lot of different hands in the pot in terms of raising that child, and they're very protected and sheltered. Back in this period of time, a 10, 11, or 12-year-old boy and or girl, honestly, would have been expected to produce, to be a productive member of the society. And now, how did that happen? Well, it happened through kind of a fusion of on-the-job training, apprenticeships, actually getting in and learning tangible skills, along with teachings from home, based in biblical teaching, based in, again, those fundamental teachings of reading, writing, and learning math. And again, that is really encapsulated in the idea of the individual family being able to determine what all that looked like. And then eventually you kind of get the evolution of, like a one-room schoolhouse around this period of time, where people would start to kind of bring in communal education together. But really, again, most citizens of this country shunned the government having their hand in that. And you almost have to kind of wonder why that is. Why would people be skeptical of a government? Well, obviously, I say that somewhat tongue in cheek, because if you look at the track record of governments in terms of trying to dictate to the people what they should do, there is kind of this bent or bias of being skeptical, because you know that every time the government acts, it's taking away freedom and liberty away from you, which is really ironic, because again, when you go back and you look at a period of time, for example, even like Jefferson, who, you think about Jeffersonian democracy and Jefferson and, small government, lowercase r republicanism, even he himself fell kind of victim to the power and persuasion that the national government could have. And what we see is attempts to try to get people to come to nationalizing an education system really get cloaked in being able to mask it as, hey, we need this because we need to preserve our democracy. Jefferson said this, quote, public happiness should be rendered by liberal education, worthy to receive and able to guard the sacred deposit of the rights and liberties of their fellow citizen. So in other words, what he's saying here is that there's no other way really to protect and develop our system of government and our society other than through a liberal education. And that gets taken even further by Dr. Benjamin Rush, who, if you're not familiar with him, is a founding father, one of the signers of the Declaration, a member of the Continental Congress. He put together a piece back in 1786 called The Thoughts Upon the Mode of Education Proper in a Republic. And one of his quotes there that I thought was kind of astounding and really rings the alarm bells of why we have to be skeptical of a mass compulsory education system is he says, our schools of learning, by producing one general and uniform system of education, will render the mass of the people more homogeneous and thereby fit them more easily for uniform and peaceable government. And to me, that was just like, wow. I mean, he's just coming right out in 1786 and he's saying the reason we need mass compulsory education is we need people not to think critically. We need people to follow along with what we say, when we say to do it, how to do it, no questions asked. That's going to yield peaceable government, right? Um, and he even says this is what he goes on to say: in education of youth, let the authority of our masters be as absolute as possible. The government of schools, like the government of private families, should be arbitrary, that it may not be severe. By this mode of education, we prepare our youth for the subordination of laws. I mean, I don't know how much more clear you can be about it. I mean, the guy's just coming out and saying we need subordinate citizens in this country. We don't need free, independent thinkers. What was driving people westward? Innovation, right? Everything about moving westward was all about having to come up with new ways to survive, new technologies, new developments, new languages, new relationships. Everything about that was antithetical to subordination and following through the way that the government said that we should be doing it. And of course, then this takes on even more dark and sinister tones as we move further throughout the 19th century. You get guys like Calvin Stowe from Ohio, who was very much in favor of setting up a formalized schooling system where his was more about educating immigrants. And he said, unless we educate our immigrants, they will be our ruin. It is no longer a question of benevolence or duty or of enlightened self-interest. We are promoted to it by the instinct of self-preservation. And that's just a little slice of some of the different ideas that were being floated around in the early 1820s and 30s about that. And I mean, my goodness, could you imagine even coming close to saying something like that today? You would be canceled in a minute. So there's all of those different kind of moving pieces that are fitting in here. But one theme that we really see starting to emerge is the power of the national government. And so I want to kick it over to you, Mike. I mean, when we look at the success that we had early on in terms of, colonial getting our footing as a new nation, westward expansion. We see the kind of explosion of innovation and invention during this period of time. I think it is cause to ask the question, like, why the need for a switch? Why did we need the government to step in and put their hands into this pie, and not only do that, but then say, we are going to tell you, individual families and citizens of this country, how to educate your children.
Yeah, that's a great question. And my short answer is the people never wanted that. And that's as is usually the case with any policy that the government promotes. There's usually some sort of self-interest from a small group there that is pushing, really hard and lobbying for something, and they have some other ulterior motive. And that's exactly what we have here. I mean, it's the exact same thing that you see in politics today, because you're right. The period of the 1700s was a period of absolute robust economic growth, all sorts of fantastic innovation and invention and population increase. And there was no standardized school system. And so the idea that if we didn't have one, if the government did not provide education for us, that everybody would just be sitting around not knowing what to do, unable to read, is false, because we have historical precedent to prove it's false. And the reason it started changing, I've identified three groups, three of these kind of special interest groups that I was talking about that really, really got behind the push for state education. And it was not a majority. It was just a really, really loud minority. And these three groups were, number one, the racists, like you talked about; two, the ruling class; And number three, the teachers' unions, even though they weren't unionized at the time, it was the teachers who were really back behind this idea of going to a state run system. And I'll explain to you why in a second. But let me start with the ruling class, because that's what our government is and has been since the signing of the Constitution, since we went away from the Articles of Confederation and into a consolidated government. We have now an elite ruling class over us. And, you know, as is the case now, they thought themselves better than all of us. They thought that we needed to be managed by their wise guidance. And that was the case back in the 1800s. And so these ideas of a formalized system of conformity really is what the school system was. They started percolating a little bit. And there was a nation that had already engaged in this a little. Actually, this was fairly common in Europe, not just one nation. But we saw this taking off in Europe in the early 1800s. There was no thought of it in America. This was a free society. The government running education, forget about it. But it wasn't the case in Europe. And, obviously Europe was very autocratic at the time. So it makes sense. And one place that was starting this was Prussia. Prussia was the largest and most influential state in Germany at the time. And we're going to go back to specifically the year 1806, actually. We'll get real specific. And the Prussian army had just been defeated by Napoleon's kind of amateur ragtag army. This was humiliating for the Prussians. It was a battle they shouldn't have lost. And so for them, it was kind of back to the drawing board. What happened? How did we get this way? Do we need to reform? And they ushered in all sorts of reforms. And anybody can look this up. These are called the Prussian reform movements of 1807. And it included everything from the way that Jews were going to be treated to land reform. But key in that reform was education reform. And they had some philosophers. One in particular, his name was Johann Gottlieb Fichte. He was a Prussian philosopher who was big on state-run education, and he was key in this movement. And some of the stuff that he said, and I really encourage the listeners to buy Justin's book, Failure: The History and Results of the American School System, because you get the quotes right, and I'm going to botch them here. But Fichte was saying something along the lines of, look, once the government does this, once they implement a mandatory school system, the society will be able to run itself without the need for military or police. In other words, what he's saying is, if we do this right, we roboticize everybody and we turn them into just little robotic wards of the state that are walking like puppets. Like, think of like the government as like a marionette sitting up top, just guiding us around like ants. And he said that's the way that it should be. And he had another quote that was, again, I'm paraphrasing, but it was something along the lines of, at the end of his however many years of school, the pupil should be unable to think anything other than what his schoolmaster wants him to think. I mean, that is, we're not talking, it's not just indoctrination. I think that would be mild and generous. It is reprogramming individuals, taking away their individuality. So that's what the Prussian system was about, and they implemented. And there were two important provisions in this Prussian system, Justin. It had to be free, right? So that nobody could say, oh, we can't afford it. So the state's going to pay for it. All right, you can't get out of that. And then it had to be compulsory. So there was no mandatory opt-out. Everybody had to go, and they enforced truancy, the same way that we do here. You don't send your kid to our state indoctrination center, again, state reprogramming center. Sorry, so you don't send your kid. We're going to come and get you. So they had police on it and everything else. Okay, but that's in Prussia and it's 1806. What the heck does that have to do with the United States? Well, look, there were progressives, people of the exact same mindset here in the United States, and they were in influential positions. And one such was a man named Horace Mann, and he's very, very, talked about in glowing terms in the textbook. Is sometimes called the father of the American education system, and that's true. He really was. But he served all sorts of posts in Massachusetts. He was served in Congress, and he at this point in time, he's the superintendent of the Massachusetts State Board of Education, the only such post that existed at the time. No other state had a superintendent of education because, like you already identified, Justin, it was just left to the families. But anyway, what he wanted was he wanted to make sure that we were programming the citizens correctly. And so he went over to Europe to evaluate national school systems. He looked at a lot of them, England, Sweden, Switzerland, but the one that had the biggest impression on him was the Prussian system. He loved the obedience. And it's honestly sick. He was just looking at the kids, they're sitting in rows, raising their hands to talk, all of the same functions that we see today in school. He thought, well, this is fantastic. And so he came back and he pitched his case to the Massachusetts State Board of Education, and anybody can go onto the internet and you can read what he said. These are in his Horace Mann's letters to the State Board of Education. I think he wrote 12 of them. And I believe it was number 7, but I could be wrong there. Again, buy Justin's book and you'll know for sure. But in the 7th one, he said this Prussian system is the one that we have to go with. I mean, this system of programming little kids was the system that he said that they had to go with in Massachusetts. And they did. They implemented it by 1852. There was a free, mandatory, state-run education system in Massachusetts. Now, at the time, with Boston having the influence that it had, obviously, with Massachusetts being the oldest colony, second oldest colony, I suppose Virginia was. But, the Northeast, Massachusetts was kind of the hub of the Northeast. And so the other states soon followed suit, Connecticut and such, New York. And since the Northeast was more or less the social, political, and economic hub of the United States, it was about 50 years before every single other state had followed suit too. Because then it was like, what, you're not doing this, you don't want to educate. And so everybody fell in line. And it didn't take that long. All of a sudden, we have free mandatory education here in the United States. So when you were talking about or asking about, Justin, about that switch, it happened almost so fast. It was in the blink of an eye. Nobody knew. And so that was the reasoning for the ruling class. Now, the second group that I talked about were the racists. Well, you mentioned this already with Calvin Stowe. These people like Horace Mann, people want to see something interesting. Look up the Know Nothing Party. Right? The Know Nothing Party, this is a now defunct party, but they were very, very prominent in Massachusetts in the 1840s. And Horace Mann was part of this Know Nothing Party. The reason they got the name Know Nothing is because they would beat the crap out of the immigrants on the street. And when they were questioned by police, it was understood that everybody would say, well, I know nothing. And so this was the name of their party. I mean, Horace Mann was a progressive, yes, and he was an absolute racist, just as the progressives today are racist, but they cloak it in something else. And so what they were absolutely sick of all the Central Europeans coming in, and the Irish especially. They thought that the Irish were basically subhuman, and they wanted a way to make them into white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. That's what Mann believed. I mean, if you ever look in deep to Horace Mann, and there is another great chapter in your book, Justin, about his belief in phrenology, which is essentially the belief that Western Europeans, which he was Anglo-Saxon, are just better people. I mean, it's as racist as it gets. And so he instituted this as a way, because Massachusetts was seeing an influx of immigrants, obviously Boston Harbor, that's not hard to understand. Everybody knows the history. And they wanted to reprogram them, make them more like Americans. And so you had the racists involved too. But then lastly, the teachers and the teachers unions, because they just wanted to make it easier on themselves. Back at this time, it was up to the teachers in order to collect their own tuition. And that wasn't always easy when we're talking about the mid 1800s, right? Because you had just simple logistical problems. Like today, when we're sitting here recording, Justin, it was 3 outside the last time I checked, and there was snow everywhere, and we have paved roads. Imagine this back in 1850. How are you going to collect the tuition, especially if the homesteads and the farms are a mile apart? It was a pain in the neck. And sometimes you would go and people didn't have the ability to pay. Sometimes they were only able to barter. Sometimes there was a bad harvest, no fault of the people themselves. And so it was just, anyway, collecting tuition was somewhat of a pain in the neck. So if you had a system where the government would collect it coercively under the threat of imprisonment if you don't pay your taxes, Well, gosh dang, that takes that huge, I mean, that huge burden off of the teachers. So they were pushing hard, saying, oh, yeah, we need this. And you can read it like in New York, you could hear these teachers, they were saying, like, yeah, we need it because if we have a state education system, it's going to make everybody more civilized and you're going to see crime go down and blah, 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 stuff like that. Same thing that we hear today, but yeah, where's crime worst? In the inner cities where the public schools are the worst. They're making all the exact same arguments, but it had nothing to do with educating or civilizing or whatever. It had to do with them wanting money. And man, if anybody were to talk about what is driving the teachers unions today in 2022, it is nothing but money. They want things as easy as possible. We read the reports of them not refusing to go into school in Chicago over this mild variant that it does nothing but give you a runny nose, and they're saying, oh, it's unsafe. They just don't want to get out of bed. And you never hear it from the upper echelon in education, never. Now, wouldn't it just be like statistically improbable that every single principal and superintendent in the United States believe that the best way to provide education is through the state? Wouldn't you think that there would at least be one somewhere who thought, you know what? If we can provide electronics and internet service and food and everything privately, maybe, and there's so much innovation there, maybe we could do the same with education. Like, you're telling me one person, no, you'll never hear anything. Why? Because they're collecting big salaries and they don't have to, like, there's no competition. It's not like you're in the sales world where you have to actually compete and scratch and claw, and you don't know if your next paycheck is going to be there. It depends upon whether you make the sale or not. Well, what if you were able to collect six figures and you just knew every single week what that dollar amount was going to be, or that raise amount was going to be 2% every year, or whatever it is? You just have to have the school board approve it. Boom, stamped, it's done. Who wouldn't want that? And so their motivations, it's not about education. It wasn't about education for them. It wasn't about education for the racists. It was about, wanting just good white people. And it wasn't about education for the ruling class. Just like you said, they wanted people who would submit to peaceable government. Oh my God. I hadn't heard that quote before you read it. And when you read it, I almost fell out of my chair, because it's like, this is Benjamin Rush saying exactly like you said it, Justin. Sit there, shut up, listen to what we say peacefully, don't think critically about it, and don't you dare ask questions. Because, and what was the year you said that was? Was it 1786 that he said that? I
Yes.
mean, he was probably saying that in response to Daniel Shays, who said, "We're not paying these higher tech. I'm not paying this." And he was like, "Okay, well, we need an indoctrination system that gets you to pay it." I mean, it's just, the point is, I guess my ending point is, there were some small special interests at play here, the way that we see in today's policy, and none of those interests had education at the forefront. It was never about education. It was always about something else.
That's absolutely right. Great points. And the other thing too, if you want to look at it from a microcosm to kind of also add on to what you were talking about in terms of the role of professionalizing education, and clearly one of the ways we see that is through the licensure of educators, right? We want to have licensed educators, people who are knowledgeable on, how to educate children. The psychology of how children develop become a huge thing in the 19th century. And there's a lot of questionable things that have been implemented into the way in which we try to educate children. But beyond anything with that, even too, thinking back to the time of the one-room schoolhouse and the need to give the educator and the system more power, is a lot of these guys are saying these children are unruly. There's a couple of fantastic books that were written, one in particular that focuses a lot here in the state of Indiana on the history of the one-room schoolhouse. And if you read some of the accounts of what early schoolmasters went through with these rough and tumble rural children that they were taking, and I mean, think about it. Think about what happens psychologically to you when you're taken from being free, and quite literally free. I don't mean free like, oh, do I want to wake up in the morning and have eggs and bacon, or do I want to go to McDonald's, or do I want to have coffee or juice or whatever. I'm talking about like you're free to go about throughout the day, free to roam the land, free to build whatever kind of shelter you want, engage in trade with whoever you want. I mean, just really kind of at that core freedom. And you take that individual and then you put them into a building, right? Along with 10, 15, 20, 30 other kids. And it may not even be people your age. You're mixed in all across ages and everything, which I don't think is wholly bad. But I mean, when you're first shocking the system, right, it can be an issue. And so, what do you expect the behavior to be like, right?
And then
And
they're
so,
wagging their finger at you the whole time. Hey, 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 I'll do
yeah,
this. This,
yeah,
this. Yeah,
right,
right.
right, absolutely. So there's definitely that aspect to it as well, and I think a lot of what we see develop in terms of the power control that schools have over the development of children and how they're going to learn, what they're going to learn, when they learn it, and all that stuff is a direct result of that breaking of the will, right? Breaking of the free spirit that an individual has, and there's been a lot of writing about that. The other thing I want to hit on, Mike, and I know that this is something that you and I have had many conversations about when we talk about the historical roots of the education system being established in the United States the way that we know it today, even still, and it really has not changed that much fundamentally from the time that you just laid it out there to where we are today in 2022. The one thing that I would try to get the listener to engage with and understand, though, is that what essentially school has been boiled down to. And we always talk about understanding the difference between education and school. We don't have an education system, we have a schooling system, right? And so I think the important differentiation in that is that what school does versus what education does. And education allows you to be independent, free thinker, critical analysis, all the things that we hear proponents of the schooling system talk about, but it's basically just lip service, right? They need to cloak it
Yeah.
and mask it and all these things. We know those things aren't happening. But one of our favorite authors and somebody that I relied a lot on in writing Failure is a man by the name of Dr. Brian Kaplan. And Dr. Kaplan is an economist from George Mason University. He wrote a book called The Case Against Education. And basically, in that book, kind of one of the main themes to it is that what schooling has become is what he refers to as a signaling mechanism, which is to say that really all it does is that one of the things we hear proponents of our schooling system talking about is we got to prepare kids for the future, right? That your education is going to equal your opportunities in life in terms of jobs and salaries. And to a degree, they're right. And to the point where Dr. Kaplan would even say it's gone off the rails. And in fact, that's all education has become. Forget learning the classics, forget getting a liberal education, which is one of the things that they love to talk about. I have people all the time who are big proponents of state schooling. They say, well, we got to teach these kids a liberal education. We got to give them art and science and humanities and foreign language and gym and all of these things. We got to get a well-rounded citizen. But the results over 200 years say, but we're not producing well-rounded citizens. And Dr. Kaplan says, in fact, a lot of what you learn in school, you're going to forget almost immediately. So what are you getting out of your education? All you're getting is a certificate that says, I stuck through the system through this number of years, whether that's I graduated from high school and I entered into the workforce, or I did community college, or I got a 4-year degree, or I went on to do a master's degree. And the further along that you go, the more willing you are signaling to the market that you're willing to comply, right? Because you're conforming to what society says. What is society saying? The more education you get, the better off you're going to be, right? I know people who have an associate's degree, who have no degree, who are making more money than I am, right? Skilled trade positions, apprenticeships that get you into positions like plumbers, electricians, so on and so forth, making more money than I make. And I have a master's degree, right? So obviously the system can be bucked, and it should be as much as we can. That's why you're starting to hear more of a call for vocational type of training, right? As opposed to continuing on and dumping hundreds of thousands of dollars in student loans on worthless gender studies degrees and things of that nature. So at any rate, my point to all that is that when we look at what the results have been, right? We've laid out kind of the foundational history of education. Okay, what have the results been? The results is this thing is just kind of formed itself into this mass blob of conformity. Do what we tell you to do, and we're going to cloak it and mask it in all this flowery language. But at the end of the day, people are no better off in terms of fundamental skills of reading, writing, comprehension, and so forth than they were back in, say, 1805.
No, you're 100% right. And you want to know why, Justin? Because it's just a big government jobs program. That's all it is.
Yeah,
It's the biggest
absolutely.
redistribution of wealth that there is in society. We're told that you need to have a gym teacher. Oh my God, we have the fattest population on the planet. So what has it done? We've been teaching kids health education, and half the girls 16 and under are pregnant. Like, okay, so what is it doing? Like you're saying, but we're told this, that it has to happen, and all it is a way for, like I was talking about, the teachers union, to for the society, for the community to produce jobs, have available jobs, good paying jobs. They keep pushing the salaries higher for anybody and everybody who wants them. If anybody wants to do this, just go into a normal community, like look up county records and look up the employer, who is the largest employer in the county. Like, go through the various counties in your state or wherever you're looking from. I guarantee you that right up there at the top for every single one, it's going to be the county or the city, the public school system, because that's what it's turned into. It's just a giant jobs program. And so we're going to take all sorts of money from all sorts of tax bases, whether it be farmland tax or sales tax, or however the state rearranges the way that they collect money, and we're going to redistribute it out so that somebody who may or may not have an intelligence level higher than my 9-year-old is going to have a good job with $40,000 a year. And I'm telling you, Justin, look, I don't mean to be, I really don't mean to sound elitist here. I'm just saying the truth. In my years, I've seen a lot of educators come in and out of the building. I have seen literally some of the dumbest people imaginable in a position of teaching. And not just that, you've seen perverts, all sorts of stuff. This system, if anybody looked at it objectively, would say, okay, we got to shut this down. If education is the objective, clearly that objective is not being met. Yet it just gets pushed and pushed and pushed. And every time you bring to them the notion that they're not achieving their objectives, it's always because of some sort of shortfall with we don't have enough money, we don't have enough teachers, it's because the class sizes are too big, whatever it is. It's just that if we took this failing system and enhanced it, then yeah, we'll get our objectives. Oh my God, how can people not see through this?
Yeah, it is infuriating, and especially as I think you and I have both tried to open the eyes of people to think about, what this is like, and I think we both are in a solid position of saying, look, all we want is for the individual to be able to decide what is best for them and their family. That's it. We just want parents to be able to say, look, if I'm assigned this school by my zip code and I've been sending little Johnny or little Susie to that school for 6, 7, 8 years, and by and large, we're happy with what they have, fine. Who am I to tell you, right? But then don't turn around and tell me, if I live across the street from you, that I want to send my son or daughter to a private school or a charter school or homeschool, that I am somehow siphoning talent away from the school system, or that all I care about is companies that can earn a profit on children, or all those other standard, or like if I want to homeschool, like, my kid won't be socialized. I mean, all the objections that all these people bring up to anything other than the public school system. Listen, we've got this issue going on in Indiana right now, HB 1134. They're looking at trying to change the way in which some teachers can talk and can't talk about sensitive topics. And I'm sure it's all a buzz in the building that you're in, Mike, and all throughout the state, because I've seen it on Twitter. They're losing their collective minds. ISTA is melting down. And no less than the head of the School of Education for IU, which is the largest probably teacher college, I would imagine, in the state, tweeting out that the General Assembly needs to worry about real issues such as a budget, short-term funding, a shortfall of funding. And I'm sitting here going, like, how can somebody in that position say something like that when over half of the state's biennial budget goes to education? What are you talking about? We don't
And
have.
Look at the number. They go up every year.
Yeah.
Every year they go up. Anybody can look that up.
And to your point, we don't have a funding problem. We have a budgeting problem. It's like these Pike Township teachers here. I was on with one of the local radio shows not too long ago, and I brought this up. Here is Pike Township's one of the larger school districts in central Indiana, in the Indianapolis area. And these guys are talking about, oh yeah, we need more funding, and they're calling out and they're shutting down schools, and they're leaving parents have to scramble for solutions on what to do, all because they're upset about their pay pay. And I went online, there's transparency laws. You can find out how much teachers are making. You would be shocked by how many classroom teachers are making over $60,000 as a classroom teacher, some as high as in the 90s. Right. And then, of course, then the administrators, they get their 6-digit salaries, they get their $1 insurance, and they sit in their office and they close the door and they shut their ears and eyes to everything that's going on. But yet they're the first behind the microphone, pounding the podium about how we need more funding for our schools. Give me a break. I know this gets us both really fired up, and I know that we can easily get on a rabbit hole. Guys, listen, the point is this, right? When we think about the history of education in this country, in our society, and we look at the results that we got in the short-term window that we had from post, colonial new era of being a newborn nation to the time where, as Mike laid out and started talking about, more of a centralized, consolidated, we had positive results. We had tangible, real benefit from that. You could see innovation and design and a lot of good things. I mean, that doesn't mean that society was utopian, but it was moving in the right direction. And when you analyze and critique the 200 years since then, roughly, that we've had this mass compulsory system, I don't know how you can't look at the results and say this thing isn't working. Or you could say it is working the way they designed it, right? Which is always the kind of the is it broken, is it not type thing.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, I want to make one real quick point before we leave here today. You had just mentioned the socialization problem and or the socialization argument, because I hear that all the time, and that's that's the number one thing, because it's across the board. Homeschoolers always score better, across the board. And then so what they'll say, yeah, but they're not socialized. Or really, when was the last time a homeschooler shot up shot up the place? Yeah, that seems like pretty much reserved for public school kids, that go into there. And so I don't even want, don't tell me that. They say that, and there's absolutely nothing to back it up. Like, you talk about being, socially not even misfit, but just deviant or whatever. It's not the homeschoolers. It never has been. That argument. Sorry, I had to speak on it because it just makes me so mad, because I know a lot of them, and they're fantastic.
Oh,
fantastic
yeah.
people. And they are so well put together. The fabric is, you can tell there's something dense and solid there. And what the public school system churns out are ones who we go, I don't know if that's somebody that we want to release into society later on.
Well, and yeah, what they're really masking that with is because I've taught in public school. Obviously, now I'm teaching in a co-school, which is basically a mass group of homeschoolers that have come together for a little bit of supplemental instruction. I've seen both parties. What they don't like is they don't like the free spirit. They don't like the free thinking aspect of a homeschooled student. I get challenged a lot more in where I teach, and it's fine. They're not rude. They're not disrespectful about it. It's just, you can tell that they have thought about these things, and they haven't been conditioned to say, like, okay, you need to learn this for the test, and then let's move on. And throughout the day, if you're not sitting this way, acting this way, doing it this way, something's wrong with you. They are naturally curious. They ask a lot of questions. They challenge a lot of assumptions. They will dig in on their own and look for things and investigate more on their own. And that's what adults don't like, right? Because
that's antisocial, according to
right, yeah, absolutely. So yeah, it's crazy to think that that's the case. But anyway, yes, we could do.
We better stop, or we're going to go on forever.
I was going to say we could do a whole series on different things related to this. There's so much that I had to shelf that you got to eliminate for this format. So with that, let's talk about what we might be covering next week. Mike, I had a thought. Something that kind of came to my mind was, we talked a couple of episodes ago about relations between U.S. citizens as the nation has been established in the 1800s and the westward expansion with native tribes, right? Native Americans. And we know kind of that narrative. We covered that in that episode. But it also got me thinking more about understanding fully kind of the preconceived notions, the things that were never taught about those native tribes prior to European arrival, even in the age of exploration. And, typically the way that that narrative is taught is through the Maya, Aztec, and Inca. And here were these tribes, and here's what they did. Here's what they kind of thought. But that's it, right? I mean, there's very little in terms of uncovering some of the conceptual ways in which their society functioned, the diversity in those cultures, how they interacted with one another. So I thought maybe we might be able to cover an episode on that. How's that sound?
No, that is a great idea because yeah, if you were to ask a kid who had just finished maybe high school, tell me something about pre-Columbian society here in the Americas, they would say the three that you mentioned, which were Aztec, Inca, and Maya, because that's it. Well, none of those are in North America. Like none of those are in where the United States currently is. What about some of these North American tribes? And do we ever learn about their cultures? And I think the point that you just mentioned there, the diversity, that is the key. Because when we tend to talk about Native Americans, we talk about them in just this kind of homogenous grouping, like it's just Native Americans. And then, it was Native Americans against Europeans. Not really, like not at all. They were just every bit as different as Europeans. So that's a great idea.
All right, that sounds good. Well, we will plan on bringing that episode to you next week. Again, thank you guys so much for the support. I've been humbled by seeing the numbers continue to rise. More and more people are being drawn to the Facebook fan page. If you go to facebook.com, search They Never Taught Me That, you'll find the group page there. I post all the episodes up there. Every now and then I'll engage with some listeners as well. If you have questions, comments, feedback, anything, you can leave it all there. You can also contact us directly through our email, margisonandspears@gmail.com. We'd be happy to get any suggestions or feedback that you have there as well. So until next time, you have now heard another episode of They Never Taught Me That.